So it seems customary to start these talks with an announcement of when we first met Jeff. We think it was 1974 at the Summer Institute in Amherst, Massachusetts, which was the famous one, where Barbara Partee was giving lectures on formal semantics, and Hans Kamp, for that matter. So that's what we think. But since then, I've got to know him very well, of course. We've both taken part in the Cambridge Grammar of English language. And what I have to say today is related to that. It's also related to work that we've done subsequently, because it concerns the distinction between complements and modifiers at a syntactic level, or if you prefer, arguments and adjuncts at a semantic level, very closely related. Now, this distinction looks a bit like Edinburgh Castle. It's sort of on a big granite rock, and all one can do is probably fire an odd cannon shot at it. It's been around for a long time, it has a very solid base. But what I would like to do today is just to concentrate on one little subset of complements, supposedly, that we put into the Cambridge Grammar, where I'm not at all convinced that that was the correct decision. It's to do with attributive adjectives. So, let me just give a little bit of the granite block underneath Edinburgh Castle. First of all, the distinction between complements and modifiers in the English noun phrase dates to generative discussions of the parallelisms between clause structure and nominalizations, these, in 1960. So, in conjunction with much earlier and widely accepted notions that verb classes are to be distinguished in terms of complementation, Jesperson, for example, the search for parallelism led to the postulation of a corresponding complementation system for deverbal nouns. Then we had Chomsky's 1970 remarks on nominalization, where the whole system was essentially extended to nouns more generally. Baker followed that up. Then we had Jackendorf, the supposed parallelisms between verb and noun phrase complementation and the distinction between complements and adjuncts were enshrined in structural terms in the X-bar theory of syntax. And initially, the complement modifier distinction in noun phrases was applied to post-head dependence. The student of chemistry is a classic kind of example of a complement, as opposed to the student with long hair, which would be a modifier. Everybody's familiar with this. You have then a structural representation. You can change the node labels around if you like, but basically the student of chemistry, the prepositional phrase of chemistry sits as a sister to N and is below some kind of N bar node, whereas in the case of the adjuncts you have a sister to N bar, not N. This is something that we changed in the Cambridge Grammar of the English language by only having a category nom, which basically does away with the N bar level. And a nom can sit above both a head noun and a complement, or it can sit above a head noun and a modifier. No distinction in terms of structural position, although there still is a distinction in terms of function. And that's for various reasons, which I won't go into at the moment. Okay, that was extended to pre-head dependence, I think by Andrew Radford in 1988, although I'm not totally sure about that. So we had examples like the English teacher, where it's modifier, where English is basically the nationality. Or we had the English teacher, teacher of English, where it's English the language. And both of those would be complements. And there was this sort of idea that if you had something like a complement prepositional phrase and you had a corresponding pre-head noun, then that would be a complement, but pre-head. And then we get things like the English teacher. These are sort of famous examples from that era, where the English which is closest to the head teacher has to be basically the subject taught, and the one before it is the nationality, or so it's said. Okay, then we had this parallel development in formal semantics with the analysis of nominalizations as having an argument structure, like that of clauses. And this was quickly extended to the postulation of a more general class of relational nouns. These would be the ones that take essentially arguments, semantic arguments, corresponding to complements in the syntax. These would be things like brother, friend, king, leg, and edge, all of which sort of imply that there is something that you're a brother of, king of, and so on. And so on. The semantic representations then of the verb and the noun are in essence very, very similar, even if the meanings of y and x differ in their relation to the predicate. But basically the idea is that you apply lambda x, and you've got x, the subject studied, and you've got x, student of that same subject. So, all very nice. This has persisted until quite recently, I would say, and indeed is part of the granite block underneath Edinburgh Castle. So this syntactic distinction between complementation and modification has largely survived intact in subsequent structural analyses of English noun phrases. In CGL it's slightly different, it's the functional level, not the actual tree structure level. And the existence of a class of relational nouns remains, I think, a widely accepted postulate in formal semantics. Now, we come to the ones which I'm going to be talking about today. Attributive adjectives, or pre-head adjectives, perhaps more properly, are for the most part treated as modifiers rather than complements, for obvious reasons. But there's one class of examples, those in 6a, where the adjective appears to express an argument of the predicate denoted by the head noun. So we have cardiac massage, which is similar to heart massage with the noun, which is similar to massage of the heart, prepositional phrase, and most people would take that as a compliment. Maybe not. Some people, as I'll come to. We have electrical supply. Well, you also have electricity supply with the noun, and supply of electricity, similar. And then there are cases even like financial advisor, where you have finance advisor and also advisor on finance. And by sort of the standard kinds of ideas about complements, the choice of preposition is fixed. Here it's advice on, not advice of, or something like that. So this would probably by most people taken to be a complement. Now, Heinz Gigerich, is Heinz here? Don't see him.
Heinz isn't here. He had already made other arrangements when he first heard about this meeting because of an unfortunate absence from the lists to which he was sent. Sad that. Yeah, Heinz is not around.
Okay, pity, because Heinz distinguishes these as a subset of what he calls associative as opposed to attributive adjectives. There are others. There are things like papal death plot, where papal is a similar kind of thing. It's basically a subject kind of relation rather than anything else. Or an agent. Sorry, no, that's a patient one. I got the wrong one there. It's sort of papal
announcement.
There's papal emissary. That's a nice one.
Papal bull.
Anyway, the ones that we're talking about here are ones which seem to have something like a theme relation, the kind of examples that I've been talking about before. So, examples. You seem to have similar sequencing effects in nouns and adjectives in this kind of role. Constant electricity supply, not really electricity, constant supply, constant electrical supply, and electrical constant supply. Okay, Heinz likes to think of these things like electricity supply as being rather more like compounds rather than anything else. I'll come back to that, but that is the sort of ordering constraint, supposedly. A second class then looks similar, and that consists of cases like criminal lawyer, ecological expert, or legal secretary, where you don't have advisor, where it's clearly related to the noun advise, and you've got the corresponding verb. But these, you seem to have a similar relational interpretation. A lawyer who handles criminal cases by virtue of the activity associated with the denotation of the head. Expert in ecology, that would be more close. Secretary who deals with legal matters. There's no direct nominalization in these cases. So, what did we do in CGEL? These adjectives, both the ones which are transparently related to verbs, these adjectives, like the prehead nouns, are considered a complement in both of these two cases, where you have a head noun which is related to the verb, like advisor, and also in the cases like expert, where it isn't. So, subcategorization of prepositions was the argument used here. Electrical supply, supply of electricity. Ecological expert, expert in ecology. It's the same argument that was used right from the beginning by Radford. Now, am I happy with that? Probably not. I think that's going to be the main point of today's talk. CGEL has ordering constraints for noun phrase dependence. And there are two types: rigid, supposedly ordering constraints, which are marked by the double bracket, and what are called labile ordering constraints, which are relatively free, although there might be a preferred order. You can depart from that for various kinds of contextual reasons. So, the key one, determiner, pre-head modifiers and then pre-head complements. And this is what I'm not at all sure about, whether it's really correct that we should have this class of pre-head complements in noun phrases. Because this is claimed in CGL to be a rigid constraint. And then the pre-head modifiers are divided into early and residual. Earlier things like numerals and so on. The residual ones, there is a general kind of semantic ordering. And various people have different representations of this, but it starts with evaluative adjectives at the beginning, then general properties, age, color, provenance, where something comes from, Italian, or whatever, manufacture, what it's made of or made by, and type is the last one, which would be closest to the pre-head complements. So, question then, is it right to have a distinction between pre-head modifiers and complements in NP structure, or more generally between complements and modifiers? That's a huge edifice. There are people who have doubted this. Evelyn Kaetzer, for example, is I think one of the earliest that I know of to have started looking at the arguments based on various kinds of anaphora for complement versus modifier status. Things like anaphoric 1 or do so, which are claimed only to sit in front of modifiers, not complements. And there are counterexamples to this. I came across a paper by Spanish writer Portero Munoz, 2013, where she also suggests that there should be no distinction in nouns in front of other nouns. This is based on a corpus study, essentially, where she looks at the strength of collocations between the pre-head noun and the head noun, and she basically says that if you have a strong collocation, you might expect the strongest collocations to be with complements rather than the adjuncts. However, there's one thing that everybody should be aware of with respect to nouns, and that is they do behave rather differently to verbs in that no noun obligatorily has a complement. And this is one thing
What
Jeff
about
and I and Barbara
fondness?
Schultz and Eva Berlager tried to.
Fondness.
What?
Fondness.
Fondness.
And fondness,
Okay, we
one
could-
of the few adjectives that are obligatory.
Yeah, we suggested denizen, but actually denizen turns out not to be correct. There are multiple corpus examples.
Find
where
out
you
about
can
fondness,
denizen.
because that's the one I always use.
We'd have to sort of check.
Well, I
We
mean,
did-
Shakespeare says, I am too fond, you know, so there's,
But that's Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Ah, okay. There are things like dint in by dint of.
Yeah.
All right, that's the sort of idiomatic prepositional phrase type. But we have looked at this a little bit since CGL, and they don't seem
Okay.
such. Well, okay. In this paper,
I think
we looked at
British
2013 one on the
ballistic counter
slide.
examples
We looked
totally work.
at anaphoric 1, and the end result of that was that we found that there was no real case for a distinction between relational and other types of nouns. It's impossible to draw a dividing line with any real value between relational and non-relational, because one occurs across the board in different frequencies. And then I came across this paper by Adam Przokowski, who is an LFG HPSG worker from Warsaw, where in LFG, he basically suggests that the complement modifier distinction should be abandoned altogether, and one should just have a single category, if you like, dependent. And you would have different types of dependent. Okay, there would be subject for sure, there might be object, and there might be various kinds of semantic dependent. But you wouldn't have a distinction between oblique, which is the complement category in LFG, and adjunct, which is the modifier category. Why? Well, he looks at things like obligatoriness, and nouns don't have any obligatoriness. Verbs do, but you don't need to have a complement modifier distinction in order to establish that something is obligatory. You can do that simply by making a specification on the verb. This kind of example is reside. So you reside in Italy or wherever. That's a locative. It's obligatory. You can just refer to the fact that reside needs to have a locative following. Simple as that. So this is the sort of the extreme of the view that the complement modifier distinction doesn't exist at all. There's no way of making a distinction. Now, I'm going to finish today by looking at a couple of case studies of these associative types of adjective in Giegerich term, with two particular head nouns. The first one is student. So, first of all, I tried a Munoz type procedure to have a look at what the collocates were, just to get an idea what's going on here. It's quite interesting, I think. The column, which has 236, 193, etc., is basically the number of occurrences, and this is the British national corpus. And the figure on the right is the log likelihood, so it gives you an idea of the strength of the collocation based on the number of times you would expect these two words to co-occur. So mature is the most common collocate, don't know why. University, postgraduate, fellow, overseas, research, graduate, full-time, all nouns. Medical, one adjective, which possibly represents the category that we are interested in, i.e. student of medicine. Notice the rest of them are basically subcategorizations of students. They would belong to the category that we call type in the Cambridge Grammar, occurring very close to the head noun when there's no complement, supposedly. Medical and mature, okay, it's an adjective, but it belongs to the type. So that struck me as interesting. We seem to have as the closest correlates of student things which are to do with the type of student rather than what they study. So I then decided to have a look at the thematic adjectives, the ones which represent what is studied. And you notice medical, 159 examples. It's not surprising that that one occurred at the top there in the list of collocates. Medicine student, 0 examples. Just don't seem to get that. With theology, it's a bit sort of more varied. Theological student, theology student, 9 to 5. Actuarial student, 4 of those. I can't think what you might conceivably have in the noun column there. It's certainly not actuary student. Architecture, 1 of each, 4, 5. Agricultural, preferred to agriculture. Dental student, okay. Dentistry student, none. So dentistry and medicine seem to have something going on here. Archaeological, archaeology. Musical, no, one of those. And music student. So music goes the other way. It seems to be music now preferred. And biblical student, Bible student. Well, what's going on here? It seems to me that this does show that adjectives and nouns are, if you like, in a way behaving very, very similarly in this position. And it's sort of rather arbitrary whether you choose the adjective or the noun, at least with this particular subset of adjectives. Why did we get musical student? I thought I'd have to put this in because it's a Scottish example and perhaps somebody can enlighten me. And in Scotland, a Lasmo Arts Trust has been set up to provide cash awards for promising musical students. I presume that means music students and not students of musicals or something like that. But somebody might know what Lasmo is. Okay, collocations of dependence. Well, this was sort of there in case Heinz Giegerich was around. Here you have basically coordinations of two of these forms, medical and dental students. So unless you want to have coordination introduced into compounding, this doesn't seem like an argument against having these as separate words. Medical educators and students, the reverse of that, one adjective to two head nouns. Okay, now the most important point, and that's the sequencing. What's going on with the sequencing here? Do we have theme, student of, to type, which seems to be the most strong colloquent? Well, yes, you do. 3 centres will run pilot schemes of 4-year industrially oriented courses for engineering postgraduate students. Notice that the type, engineering, is adjacent to the head. But what they study, engineering, is before that. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean that we abandon the complement idea, at least the rigid ordering idea, completely? Do we have a separate category of theme which somehow occurs before type in our ordering constraint? No, I don't really like those ideas at all. I think what's going on here is that you could reverse this and say postgraduate engineering students. Both are sort of totally plausible, and that what we should really think of engineering as here is just another type. It's a type of student. And since they're both types, you can just sort of swap them around without too much difficulty. Well, I was surprised when I saw this, but it seems to be what we have. There's another one, computing undergraduate students. Well, you could just as well have undergraduate computing student. Medical research student. Interestingly, that one doesn't go so well the other way. Research medical student.
Well, it's a parson.
Not quite sure why that is, but I'll throw that out there. I think you could have it. But anyway, medical research student is the preferred version with, if you like, the theme before the type. Okay, so there are some comparisons with post-head dependence. All right, that's just to show the student of architecture, student of art, student of the natural world. Right, so let's move now quickly to the next case study, which is advisor. When I thought about advise,
1 minute.
then I thought that really the theme here is the person who's advised, not the subject on which advice is given. Advise the president, for example. So we have examples like the presidential advisor. They're the collocates: financial, legal, investment, tactical, professional, continence, technical, scientific, and mortgage. Most of them are ones which are to do indeed with things that you give advice about. Not all of them, but most of them. Do we have theme versus type again? Resignation of presidential economic advisor. Presidential is first, economic is second. In other words, you advise the president, the subject about which you advise them is second here. You could have economic presidential advisor, but it would be a special kind of context. Presidential legal advisor, another one. So, what's going on here? I think more important than trying to establish thematic relations between a head noun and its various kinds of supposed complements is classification into types. The highest level classification, things like undergraduate, research student, occurs closest to the head noun. That's, if you like, the top level kind of distinction of students. Then you can throw in afterwards the subject that they're studying. You can do it the other way around if you're talking about, if you like, medical students, and then you want to pick out the ones who are research ones or undergraduate ones and so on. You just put them around according to the way you subdivide. So there's no evidence on the basis, I think, of this study, it's a very small one, for the relevance of the complement modifier distinction to structure-based pre-head ordering principles, which should be in the English NP. At the very least, I think we need to get rid of the idea that there's a rigid order here, but I prefer just to get rid of the pre-head complements altogether. And the bigger picture then, the theme relation in noun phrases is just one kind of semantic relation between head nouns. It's basically the type classification which wins out here in terms of ordering. Okay, thank you. Jeff?
John, I think this is, if you would you agree, possibly a unique case where a rather large change in the whole theoretical framework might need to be made in Cambridge Grammar. That Chapter 5 would really need to be revised quite a lot to take this on board, right? So it's
Well,
a case
I
where
mean,
it might have to be a second edition.
the big change would be if we were to go along with the idea that we put forward essentially, but in a limited sense, to do with the behaviour of complements, supposedly, in English, plus the fact that nouns don't seem to take obligatory complements in inverted commas.
Right.
What we could do is follow what Adam Przeworski says, that is, to get rid of the modifier complement distinction altogether, at least for noun phrases, and have just a single set of, if you like, non-determinate dependents.
Yes, that would be the big.
That would be the big change if we were to make it. You asked me if we were writing this chapter now rather than 25 years ago, what would I do? Rodney Huddleston was very much against sort of going for big changes against, if you like, well-established tradition.
But this tradition of complement versus modifier really comes out of ex-bar theory, not out of traditional grammar.
Yes.
Semantic.
So if I were writing it now, probably I would try and argue Rodney into doing that.
So So you don't need to do a whole second edition of the book, you can just do a second edition of chapter 5.
Yeah, which is 200 pages, you make it nice
It's
and
a,
one
it's a trifle, yes.
Yeah, two questions. I mean, the distinction between complements and modifiers is also a semantic one. It's not just, if I never knew anything about X-bar theory, I would still believe in it, perhaps not under those
Yeah.
labels. But, I mean, if you have semantic types, it sort of comes from that. But I just want to ask another question. I mean, I always teach my students that, verbs really do, they really do categorize some of them for objects, and you can't get them without, whereas
Yeah,
with nouns,
devour,
except,
that
and then
kind
I've
of
got a
thing.
fondness, and adjectives could always have their complements not there, except for fond, but maybe I'm wrong about those. Are you sure, I'm really asking this with no agenda, that if you push hard enough, you couldn't find that there are verbs that absolutely can't occur intransitively? So I always use the example of my students of fix. You can't say he fixes for a living, even though you could say he kills for a living. But I wonder if if Brett sat there and did his quick little searches, whether we would find that. Are we sure that that verbs have that property?
Me personally, I'm not sure. If you ask me, but I'm not pushing. Didn't want to push it that far
What?
in this talk.
Spearhead? Well, I mean, I'm just wondering if you do a nice little corpus study, where
Yeah.
you might find them. I mean, also, the things like devour
Yeah.
is given as an example, but I think that some of those, there are semantic explanations for that too. So if they're just technically idiosyncratic cases where idiosyncratically there is no intransitive fix or spearhead, whether that's really true if we did a careful corpus study. I mean, it doesn't really matter to me, but.
What did he do? He devoured and he devoured and he devoured until he finished.
And
We have last did a lovely corpus study of when verbs that you would expect to be transitive appear intransitively, and they carry a lot of social semantic meaning.
But
So
they can.
groups use them in transitivized forms to kind of signal that they're part of a group. So do you lift, for example? But she has amazing examples like, my clients prefer to scatter alone. And those are people who do cremations. Once you know about the business, you know what it means to scatter.
So we can really induce all of these into this.
Yeah, and devour is widely attested intransitively. I mean, I don't think she found any that stand up to the idea that you don't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they're not all that different from nouns and adjectives then?
Yeah.
Just in the preponderance.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and then how hard, yeah.
But nevertheless, well, it does seem to be stronger, considerably stronger with
With
verbs
verbs,
than it
yes.
is with nouns. And somehow that has to be captured. I mean, maybe one of our sort of grammars of the type Mark was talking about might capture that. I suspect it would. Who knows?
It looks more and more like taxonomic biology, where you keep having to say overwhelmingly in such and such a class you get this property, but not absolutely all. But mammals really don't lay eggs, they have live births. But all right, the platypus and the echidna are exceptions in a little tiny subclass. It looks more and more like that in
Yeah.
syntax, which is not what we thought it was going to be like 50 years ago.
I mean, it does look like basically working out the grammar on statistical kinds of principle, in the sense that you observe, or the machine observes, that with reside, so often it appears with an in complement or whatever, and thinks, okay, this has got to be.
You wouldn't want to say simply that, because like the part I want to emphasize for Amelia's evidence, for example, is that she traces it to this group creation thing. It's a socio-pragmatic thing where you kind of signal to other people in the group that you can drop the object.
Yeah.
And it's recoverable. It's not recoverable in the wider population, and that's part of what builds the in-group effect, and that's why you get so much stylization around things like do you lift. Because it signals that you do it in such a habitual way as part of a community that you can afford to drop it. So I wouldn't want to just say that the corpus data give us a certain distribution, because there's a root cause there in people.
When I was a grad student, slightly before the dawn of time, we were all taught that there were intransitive verbs and transitive verbs and ditransitives, and that covered almost everything. And there were a few other complementizer structures that you needed to learn about. And then, I'm forgetting another property of old age. Somebody did it in France, and then Georgia Green did this huge study of English and said, well, you know, after 2 years worth of work, I have several hundred complementizer patterns. Okay? So that was just, you know, the story we thought was true was just wrong, right? And so there's something else going on here. You have to think about this issue of what the complementizer structures of verbs. What's going on there? It's not that there's this small, well-constrained set of patterns. And this, it seems to me, the story that you just said, you know, what you just said, Jeff, is another example of that. That, yeah, this category is not impermeable. It's not, you know, it's better to talk about a category with a few exceptions than to say, no, there's two categories here. But it makes, you know, not that those are incompatible. But that sounds to me like what you were saying as well, that there's, not that there aren't interesting gradations or distinctions within this category, but that it's not.
Yeah, it's not. What I'm arguing against, I think, is that we shouldn't try and put a syntactic distinction on these things. It's probably more to be done at a kind of conceptual semantic level. And there you get this fluidity.
Okay, thank you very much.